We've got to the 16th part of the life of Jesus now. We start with a word of prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my salvation. Amen. I approach this one with a bit of a trepidation because it's one of the toughest sections of Jesus' life. I've called it the hour of the power of darkness. If you want to turn to the book of Luke, to chapter 22, it's where we finished the last section. So it's Luke 22 and it's verse 52, right at the end of the chapter. And Jesus said to the chief priests and to the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as against a robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this hour and the power of darkness are yours." This is a hard section to read through, to be honest. But the first thing you need to realise is it didn't go the way that the authorities wanted it to go. If we go to Matthew to start with, we'll see what the Jewish authorities were plotting at this stage. So Matthew 26, and it's verse 3 to 5. So Matthew 26, 3 to 5. Then the Jewish priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the courts of the high priest named Caiaphas, and they plotted together there to seize him by stealth and kill him. But, they were saying, not during the festival, lest a riot occurred among the people. That was their plan. They wanted to get Jesus, they wanted to get him by stealth and to arrange him to be killed, but not during the festival of Passover. If we turn over to Luke 22 again, half of their plotting seems to be working fine. Luke 22, and it's 1 to 6. Now the feast of unleavened bread, which was called the Passover, was approaching, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how they might put him to death, and they were afraid of the people. And Satan entered into Judas, who is called Iscariot, belonging to the number of the 12, and he went away and discussed with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad, and they agreed to give him money. And he consented to begin to seek a good opportunity to betray him to them apart from the multitudes. So that was the plan. They wanted Jesus to be betrayed apart from the multitudes, but they did not want it to happen at the Passover. And that is exactly what does happen. The reason being is that Jesus himself organises it. He knows what happens. He has come to fulfill the sacrificial sacrifice of the Passover, all the symbolism of that. And it's Jesus himself who at the Last Supper points out 3 times that one of them will betray them, and 2 times he specifically, in fact, all 3 times he specifically lets Judas know that he knows what is going to happen. On the 3rd time, Jesus actually sends him out of the room. Now, Judas, obviously at this point, is in a quandary. What does he do? Does he go through with it? Or does he walk away with the 30 pieces of silver and gets chased by the Sanhedrin, basically? He decides to go through with it, and so he goes to the Sanhedrin. They then have a problem. Half of what they want is going to happen. Judas can take them to Jesus alone, away from the multitudes, which is what they want, but it is going to happen at the worst moment of the Passover. It's happening actually physically on the Passover evening. And you can imagine at this point, they will not be ready for a trial of any sort. Judas turns up. They've all just got out of their Passover meals. Probably some of them have drunken a bit too much. They're all sort of bit sleepy and they want to go back to home for the evening. But suddenly Judas springs it on them. What do? Do they say, well, no, not at the Passover? Or do they take this opportunity, which they probably will not get again, of one of Jesus' inner circle actually betraying him? They decide to go ahead with it. Now this leaves them with a big problem. They are not ready. Absolutely not ready. So the whole of this night's events is based around that. They are scrabbling around desperately, trying to get something together in order to get rid of Jesus. And they have another problem. If the crowds in the morning, and Jerusalem was absolutely thronging with people, if they discover that Jesus has been arrested by the Jewish authorities, there will almost certainly be a riot. So they know they have to get everything done before the morning and get Jesus handed over to the Romans before the morning, before the people find out about it. Because if they do, they're in trouble. If they don't manage that, they're in trouble. If they get him handed over to the Romans, the people riot, well, the Romans will deal with that, which shows how much contempt the priest and the Sanhedrins actually had towards their own people. They really didn't care. One of the other things I want to bring to your attention this time is the hypocrisy of what happens this night. One of the main things the Sanhedrin and the Jewish leaders and the Pharisees accused Jesus of was not following the tradition of the elders. Now, if you remember what I've told you in the past, you had the Jewish law as written down by Moses in the first 5 books of the Bible. About the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the scribes started to try to make it more understandable for the people, which was a good thing. They wanted people to understand, and they wanted to define it more clearly so people could understand what it did mean to break the Sabbath or not to break the Sabbath, which is all right and proper. But over the interceding 400 years, the rabbis had added more and more and more stuff on top of the original teaching. And it got to the point where they regarded the tradition of the elders, the teaching of the rabbis, as more important than the scripture itself. And so that was what they accused Jesus of much of the time, of breaking these rules, which were not given by God, as opposed to breaking the scripture. They never found anywhere that Jesus actually broke any of the commandments given by God. Yet during this evening, one of my favourite teachers, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenborn, he trawled through the Talmud and the Mishnah, the Jewish writings, and he's found 22 rules that the Jews themselves broke of their own tradition this night in their attempt to kill Jesus. You've got to remember, a lot of these rules that were written down by decent, honest men who wanted to avoid exactly the type of thing that happened this night. Not all these rules are wrong. They're not, just because they're added on, it does not mean that they're wrong or in any way out of order. And you'll see that from the rules that were broken that night. One of the first rules that was broken was this. There was to be no arrest by religious authorities that was affected by a bribe. That's actually written down in their own laws. If we turn to Exodus chapter 23, this is actually based on part of the teachings given by God from Mount Sinai. So Exodus 23, and it's verse 7 and 8. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I do not acquit the guilty. And you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear sight and subverts the cause of the just. So one of the rules was that if the accusations were brought to the Sanhedrin trial and it was discovered that they were obtained by a bribe, then the case was to be thrown out. So straight away, this case should have been thrown out by their laws. Also, one of the rules is, no judge or Sanhedrin member was allowed to participate in the arrest. But if we look at Luke again, what Jesus says to them, and we're Luke 22, the end of 22, and Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him. And we know that one of the people who came out was actually the high priest's servant, because that's the one who Peter cut the ear off of. So that's two of the rules that have already said this whole thing should stop immediately. Of course, that doesn't happen. Now, remember, everything is up in the air. They're very confused. So the first thing that actually happens is recorded in John. There's 6 stages to this trial. The first stage is only recorded by John. John chapter 18. And it's verse 12. So the Roman cohort, and remember, if you listen to the last time, it may not necessarily be a Roman cohort, but certainly it's at least 450 soldiers. So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and brought him and led him to Annas, first of all. And he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Annas was spoken of in the past. He was originally the Jewish high priest. The Romans didn't like him, and they actually chucked him out of his position. The problems the Romans had, that the Jews would only accept someone from the correct family to be high priest. So they initially put a number of his sons in as high priest and chucked them out just as quickly. And Caiaphas was actually his son-in-law, but they're the one that they settled on in the end. But Annas, from the Jewish point of view, was still the high priest, and he was the godfather of this particular organisation. So what's happening here, there's a little holding operation going on, while Caiaphas, no doubt, is getting together as many people as he can from the Sanhedrin who share their point of view. They have to have at least 23 of the 71 members of the Sanhedrin to hold a trial. So you can imagine Caiaphas is running around trying to get enough people together from their various different Passover meals. Also, he's trying to get together enough witnesses, because they have to produce witnesses against Jesus. None of this was ready, none of it was prepared. So Annas basically does a holding operation. Let's carry on from verse 13. And led him to Annas, first of all, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. And Simon Peter also following Jesus, and so was another disciple. And now that disciple was known to the high priest, and entered with Jesus into the courts of the high priest. But Peter was standing at the door outside. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the doorkeeper and brought Peter in. Now this unnamed disciple, as I've mentioned before, in the book of John there are 7 mentions of an unnamed disciple. And that is almost certainly the author of the book, whom we believe to be John. Sometimes I look at this section and wonder how a Jewish Galilean fisherman was known by the high priest, but it is possible that John was actually distantly related to the priestly family. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But Peter was then brought in. Now, the people in there must have known that this other person was a disciple of Jesus. And when he brings Peter in, obviously the question arises, and in verse 17, we get that question. The slave girl, therefore, who kept the door, said to Peter, "Are you not also of this man's disciple?" And he said to him, "I am not." Now we can remember from the last time that Jesus has actually said to Peter that before the cock crows 3 times, cock crows twice, you will betray me, or you will deny me 3 times. Not betray, but deny. This is obviously the first time. Now the question is, what does the cock crowing actually mean, or the rooster crowing in some versions? Now it actually might be a genuine real-life rooster that was running around the place, or that could be heard from there. There is another option, which I have always preferred, The Romans divided the night up into 4 watches. It would be from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock, 9 o'clock to 12, 12 to 3, and 3 to 6. And those watches, they would have a change of guards, like we have at Buckingham Palace, the changing of the guards. And they would almost certainly have marked each of the changes of the guards by some sort of call. And it has been suggested that they used a trumpet or something to mark the hours. In fact, one of the historians actually says that the final call of the day was actually deliberately made to sound like a cock crowing, in order to let everybody know they'd come to wait. If that is the case, then what happens next will happen within the case of about 3 hours. So the first cock crow, you can imagine Jesus said to Peter that he would betray him after the Last Supper had finished, which would have been after 9 o'clock in the night, as they were heading for Gethsemane. So you would have had a cock crow, a trumpet called at midnight, and you'd have another one at 3 o'clock in the morning. So the 3 o'clock in the morning would have been the second cock crowing. If that is true, then obviously all of the events that happened in the Sanhedrin happen within the next 3 hours. Let's look at what happens before Annas. So verse 12. Oh, sorry, John 18, verse 19. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong section there. The high priest therefore questioned Jesus. Now this high priest is Annas, and you will see in this section that both Annas and Caiaphas are described as the high priest. That's because from the Jewish point of view, Annas was still the high priest. From the Roman point of view, Caiaphas was the high priest. Anyway, so Annas, the high priest, therefore questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered him and said, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in the synagogues and in the temples, where all the Jews come together. I have spoken nothing in secret. Why do you question me? Question those who have heard me. I spoke to them. Behold, these know what I said. What Jesus is basically saying there is, if you've got anything against me, bring it on then. Where's the witnesses? I've spoken everything openly. If you've got anything you're trying to find out against me, bring out the witnesses. This to the most powerful man in Judaism at this point. Verse 22. When he said this, one of the officers standing by gave Jesus a blow, saying, Is this the right way to answer the high priest? And Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, bear witness of me, of the wrong. But if I do rightly, why do you strike me? Annas therefore sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now at this point, there's 3 rules that they broke. The first one was that judges are always to be humane and kind. And yet here Jesus is being roughed up before the actual main court started, which was probably one of their ideas. They wanted to make him tired and stressed and to rough him up a bit so that when he got to stand before the actual court itself, he was in a less good state. The second rule was charges could not originate with the judges. They could only be investigate charges brought to them. So here's Annas desperately trying to find something against Jesus that could be brought against him by what he was saying at this stage. So in America you have the Fifth Amendment, as they call it. You can plead the Fifth Amendment, where you can say you can be silent. You don't have to say anything, because anything you might say might incriminate yourself. So there's 2 sections they brought here. The rule about being humane and kind will be broken again and again during the course of this trial. So now Jesus is sent off to Caiaphas. This probably took an hour or so while they were getting people together. The other thing to note is that Peter all this time is standing in the court of the high priest's house. So this is not actually in the Sanhedrin building up at the temple. All this is happening in the high priest's house itself. Let's go to Mark chapter 14, and it's verse 55 to 59. So Mark chapter 14, 55 to 59. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. and they were not finding any. For many were giving false testimonies against him, and yet their testimonies were not consistent. And some stood up and began to give false testimony against Jesus, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands in 3 days and build another one made without hands.'" And not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. And the high priest stood up and came forward and questioned him, saying, "Do you make no answer? What is these men are saying against you?" But he kept silent and made no answer. Again the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said to him, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds in heaven." And tearing his clothes, the high priest said, "What further need have we of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" And they all condemned him, that he was deserved death. And some began to spit on him, and to blindfold him, and to beat him with their fists, saying to him, "Prophesy." And the officers received him and slapped him in the face. That's a hard bit to read. Let's go to Matthew. Matthew 26. And it's verse 61. Now, the testimony against Jesus that was given there is repeated again in Matthew, but it's slightly different. And they said, "This man stated, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and to rebuild it in 3 days.'" And if we go back to the Mark one again, what does it say there? "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands in 3 days, and I will build another made without hands.'" So one says, "I will," and the other one says, "I am able to destroy the temple." Now that's quite a difference in the testimony, and that would have caused problems to the Jewish people. It was one of the rules that they had to follow. All witnesses must agree in every important respect. So there has to be 2 witnesses, and they have to agree in every important respect. And that's quite a different thing. One's saying he will do it, and one said, "I am able to do it." Now, it describes them as false witnesses, and there's a reason for that. If we go to the book of John, where this statement was actually said in the first place, it's John chapter 2. It's right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, when he first cleanses the temple on the very first Passover. And we'll see what Jesus actually did say. It's John chapter 2, and it's verse 13 to 22. "And the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers seated. And he made a scourge out of cords, and he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured the coin of the money changers, and overturned their tables, and those who were selling doves. 'Take these things away, and stop making my Father's house a house of merchandise.' His disciples remembered what was written, 'The zeal of your house will consume me.'" That word "consume" actually also can be as destroy. And that is effectively what happens at this stage. That is the accusation they bring against Jesus to destroy him. Verse 18, "The Jews therefore said to him, 'What sign do you show us, seeing you do these things?' And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again.' The Jews therefore said to him, 'It took 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days.' But he was speaking of the temple of his body." So if you look at what it says, destroy. In other words, you destroy this temple in 3 days, and I will raise it up again. He didn't say anything about destroying it himself. And this message, if you like, is what's going to the Sanhedrin now. You're going to destroy me. and in 3 days I will raise up again. So that is why those witnesses were false. And it should be noticed, of course, that all the things they brought against Jesus, none of them were actually guilty of death. There was no accusation they could bring against Jesus that would be suitable for the death penalty. So where Caiaphas then stands up and says to Jesus, aren't you going to answer? What are these people saying against you? Jesus didn't have to answer anything, because there was no accusation that had actually been brought against him. There's a number of rules that they broke at this stage. The first one, there was to be no steps of criminal proceedings after sunset. The exact rule is, once you can see 3 stars in the sky, any criminal proceedings must stop in the courts. This was happening sometime after midnight, before 3 o'clock in the morning. This was all happening at darkness. This was the hour of the power of darkness. No trials are allowed on the evening of the Sabbath or on a feast day. In fact, both of these rules were being broken here. It was the day of Passover. It was also a day before a Sabbath, because the day that follows the Passover is always a Sabbath anyway. And in this case, it was the real Sabbath. It was the Saturday. So both of those rules are being broken here. There are to be no secret trials, only public ones. This was most definitely a secret trial. It was being held in the high priest's own home. It was not being held, as the next rule says, Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in the hall of judgment in the temple compound. So they were breaking that rule as well. Another rule they had, all may argue in favour of acquittal, but all may not argue in favour of conviction. So in here, nobody is standing up for Jesus. He has nobody on his side at all. Those people who have been invited to this secret court are only those determined to kill Jesus. And the other rule, there were to be two or 3 witnesses, and their testimony had to agree in every detail. That actually comes from Deuteronomy. If we look that up, Jesus' favourite book, Deuteronomy chapter 19. A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or sin which has been committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses a matter shall be confirmed. If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of any wrongdoing, then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges, who will be in office in those days, and the judges shall investigate thoroughly. And if the witness is false, a false witness, and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him, that's the witness, just as he intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge evil from amongst you. So what the priest should have done at this stage is actually condemned the witnesses as false witnesses. And they were trying to put Jesus to death, so they should have actually condemned the witnesses to death. But of course that is not what is going to happen at this stage. If we go back to Matthew again, to Matthew 26. And verse 62. And the high priest stood up and said to him, Do you make no answer? What is this these men are testifying against you? The Jewish way of conducting a court. Now, in this country, what would happen, first of all, you have the accusation, or first of all, the actual indictment would be read out against the person. This is what the person has done. Then you would have the prosecuting lawyer standing up and giving the evidence against the person. Then you have the defending lawyer standing up and giving the defendants for the person. In the Jewish system, interestingly, it's the other way round. Once the accusation has been read out, the person themselves, the procedure was first the defence, then the accusation. In this case, there had not even been a charge read out against Jesus. Effectively, what could he defend himself against? What accusation was made against him? So he could say nothing for that reason. It's also been said that if Jesus did open his mouth, he could have very easily overturned all their arguments. It wouldn't have done any good in that sense, because they intended to kill Jesus one way or the other. But that Jesus could so easily have undermined all their procedures. But he did not. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. As a sheep before its shearers, he was silent and did not open his mouth. This obviously gets Caiaphas really angry, because he can't get anything out of Jesus. So what he does, he puts him under what's known as the Heren curse. Verse 63. Again, Jesus kept silent, and the high priest said to him, I adjure you by the living God that you tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. That is the highest, as it were, curse in Judaism. That at this point you have to answer. You've been put under that. You must say something, for good or bad. It's the same statement that was used by Joshua when Achan was caught in his sin. He had stolen some stuff from Jericho and buried it, and the Jewish people were defeated at Ai. When Achan and his family are pulled forward, Joshua says to them, give praise to God, which is effectively the same wording in Hebrew. Tell the truth. You have to tell the truth. You're under the curse. And he has to answer. So Jesus, at this point, answers. You have said, and what Jesus said, are you the Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus said to him, you have said it yourself. Now, we've got a phrase very much like it. Someone says something to us and you go, you said it. Which means absolutely correct. But this is the Jewish way of saying it. So Jesus said, you've said it. I am the Son of God. In some of the other Gospels, it just says at this point, yes, I am. Because obviously Matthew is specifically writing to the Jews, and he writes using this particular Jewish phrase that would be understood. Some of the others don't. What Jesus says next is important. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. Now, obviously, we're looking at that. The right hand of power must mean the right hand of God. But why doesn't Jesus use the word God? The important thing here is one of the other rules is this. The accusation of blasphemy could only be valid if the name of God itself was pronounced. Jesus here deliberately does not say the Yahweh name of God. He uses one of the other Jewish ways of saying it that suggests God but doesn't actually use the name. So he does it on purpose. But what does the high priest say? Then the high priest tore his robes and saying, he has blasphemed. But according to their law, because he hadn't said the name of God, he had not blasphemed. It's one of the other rules that is broken here. A person could not be condemned on the basis of his own words alone. And also, there was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against themselves. Now, the people who wrote those rules did it on the basis, two bases basically. It might be that this person is protecting somebody else, and they are accusing themselves in order to get somebody else off the hook. Or it might be that they want to commit suicide and they want to die. So even if someone says they were guilty, you could not pass a guilty sentence on them unless there was sufficient evidence to prove that they were the actual person involved. So both of these two rules here, and also the rule about the blasphemy, are broken. Also, what's happened next? One of the other rules. Voting for the death penalty had to be done individually be starting with the youngest, so that they would not be influenced by the elders. If you look what the high priest said here. So the high priest tore his robes and said, "He has blasphemed. What further need do we have of witnesses?" Of which he was glad, because he didn't have any. "Behold, you have now heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" I think that's a weighted question, we would call it nowadays. In other words, I have found him guilty of blasphemy. What do you lot say? Obviously, the high priest would not have been the youngest person present. So it should have been the other way around. He should have asked, well, what do you think to that? What do you think? And it would have ended up with the high priest. Something else you notice there. The high priest tore his garments. Let's go to Leviticus 21. Leviticus 21 and verse 10. "And the high priest, who is high priest amongst his brothers, or the head, whose head has been anointed with oil, has been poured upon him, who has been consecrated to wear the garments, shall not uncover his head, nor tear his clothes." It was actually illegal by the law of God for the high priest to tear his clothes. That had also been written into the Jewish understanding, because often the tearing of clothes came at the death of a loved one, or some emotional incident. And the emotions were never to be allowed into the court proceedings. So sentences were not to be passed in an emotional state. So they also added this sensitive that a high priest should never tear his clothes, especially in the matter of trials, because it should not be on emotion, it should be on evidence that a sentence was passed. Some of the other rules they break in this case. In the case of capital punishment, the trial and the guilty verdict could not occur at the same time, but must be separated by at least 24 hours. So their official way of doing it was to have the trial, to adjure the trial, to consider the evidence, and then to re-adjourn and to regather, and then to pronounce the sentence. That does not happen here. Further to that, in the case where a person was found guilty of a trial of a case that should be led to death, there should be 3 days between the sentence or the trial's results of being pronounced guilty and the sentence of death being pronounced. The idea being that the person would be pronounced as guilty, that news would be spread abroad. If there was anybody who could, in that meantime, produce evidence to show that that person was in fact innocent, that would give time for that to happen. But in this particular case, obviously the high priests do not want that to happen. They do not want time to elapse. So they have pronounced the sentence or the guilt and the sentence at the same time, on the same day. And we see that in verse 66 of Matthew 26. "What do you think?" said the high priest. And they answered, "He is deserving of death." One of the other rules is the verdict could not be announced at night, only during the daytime. All this happens at that time. Then, of course, we have once again the breaking of the rule about being humane, and they spat in his face and beat him with their fists, and others slapped him. In one talk, they talk about the Gospels. They talk about they blindfolded him and hit him and said, "Prophesy to us, tell us who just hit you." But for Jesus, it probably gets worse at this stage. Now, this is probably coming up to 3 o'clock in the morning. If we go on to... I've missed a couple of the rules. So I've missed a couple of the rules here. And some of the important one as well. A person condemned to death should not be scourged or beaten beforehand. And obviously we see that's being broken by the very Sanhedrin themselves. And there's another rule, which shows the wisdom of the person who wrote it. A unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence, since it is impossible for between 23 to 71 men to agree on anything without plotting. Now, the person who wrote this obviously knew the Jewish way. That it said of the Jews, if there's two people in the room, you'll have at least three opinions. So they saw it as completely impossible for a Sanhedrin to agree completely on anything unless there was some sort of plot going on. You have to have at least 23 men, so there's at least 23 of the Sanhedrin there present. All of them unanimously agreed on Jesus, so according to their own rules, he should have been released. Which shows the wisdom of the person who wrote that one, but unfortunately they weren't listening to wisdom that night. Let's go to the book of Luke, and it's Luke 22. From Jesus' point of view, I suspect this hurt more than all the blows and the spitting. Luke 22, and it's verse 59. And this is out in the courtyard where Peter is. And about this hour, now Peter at this stage has already twice denied that he knows Jesus. Once was when the girl pointed out. In fact, there was two women who basically pointed out to him, and he denied it. He then withdrew away into the shadow of the gates, basically. And yet, at this stage, he's seen again. And after about this hour had passed, another man began to insist, saying, "Certainly, this man too was with him, for he is a Galilean." The other Gospels actually say it was one of the relatives of the man whose ear Peter had cut off and had been in the garden too. So at this stage, it was starting to get quite close to home for Peter's point of view. And Peter said to him, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately he's speaking, the cock crowed. In the other Gospels, it actually says that Peter started cursing. And what the word actually meant is that Peter was cursing Jesus' name. So he was actually swearing about Jesus in order to prove that he had nothing to do with him. And verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken. Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. It was at exactly that moment that Jesus was led away from the trial, having been beaten, having been spat upon, and he sees Peter swearing and cursing his name. Undoubtedly, Satan thought he would stick the knife into Jesus, and he organised it for that time. But Satan was not always at the Last Supper. He did not hear the words that Jesus had spoken to Peter. Jesus knew this would happen. Satan thought he was hurting Jesus more, but I suspect Jesus was praying for Peter as he was led away. Now at this point, somebody amongst the Sanhedrin thinks that maybe they ought to do some of this a little bit legally, because at the moment everything is what we used to call a kangaroo court. Everything has been done wrongly. So at this stage, let's go to Luke again, and it's chapter 23, and it's verse 66. Oops, sorry, I think I've got the wrong verse there. 22, verse 66. 22, verse 66. And when it was day, the council of elders and of the people assembled, both the chief priests and the scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber. So now they've got their act together. They've taken him to the temple, to the courtroom, and now they're going to hold a slightly more legal retrial. So this is effectively the third trial Jesus has been through this night. One before Annas, one before the Caiaphas and his cronies, and now they're setting up another one in the temple court itself. It's quite short though, and once again, Caiaphas says to him, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will not believe. If I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power of God." And they said, "Are you the Son of God then?" And he said to them, "Yes, I am." If Jesus had said no, he would have been lying. And they said, "What further need do we have testimonies? For you have heard it from his own mouth." Once again, they are still breaking the rule about a man cannot condemn himself from his own mouth. Another rule, interestingly, they are still breaking, is that there were to be no trials before the morning sacrifice. And the morning sacrifice was actually held at 9 o'clock in the morning. What would happen in the court is that the sacrificial lamb for the first sacrifice of the day would be brought out at dawn. So the same time that this trial was happening, it would be then tethered to the actual altar itself. So that would be, say, about 6 o'clock in the morning. It would be tethered to the altar. It would be left there until 9 o'clock. And then at 9 o'clock it would be sacrificed. And there were to be no trials before that sacrifice had taken place. So even this court was still illegal. Nothing about what happened that night was allowable under Jewish law. Now, the Jews have a problem, because they want to kill Jesus, and yet within the last 6 months before this, according to history, the Roman authorities had removed the right of capital punishment from the Jewish people. So interestingly, at the Feast of Tabernacles, where they bring the woman caught in adultery to Jesus, at that stage it was probably the case that the Jews could actually stone the woman to death. But after that time, because they had a habit of killing far too many people, and the Romans, for all their faults, they liked a form of justice to be done properly. And so they removed the right of capital punishment from the Jewish people. And so they knew that they could not kill Jesus. They had to hand him over to the Romans because they wanted him to be killed. Also, they wanted him to be in Roman hands before the Jewish crowds found out about it. One of their problems was they needed a witness against Jesus. And I suspect part of their deal with Judas is that he would come up and be a witness against Jesus, saying that he had plotted against Rome or something like that. So what happened next puts them in even more of a problem than they originally had. Let's go to Matthew 27, and it's verse 1. Now when the morning had come, and all the chief priests and the elders and the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death, they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate the governor. Then Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned. He felt remorse and returned his 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But they said to him, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Remember the rule that if someone was betrayed, there was supposed to be a gap in between, so that any further evidence could be brought to the council in favour of that person. Here is evidence. Here's Judas actually saying, "I have been bribed," and that Jesus is innocent. And both of that they ignore. And he, that's Judas, threw the silver pieces into the sanctuary and departed, and he went away and hanged himself. Now that gave the Jewish leaders a problem. Two problems, in fact. We'll get onto the second one in a while. The chief priests took the pieces of silver and said, "It is not lawful for us to put them in the temple, since it is the price of blood." Now this, Jesus would probably describe, is straining out a gnat but swallowing a camel. Both animals being non-kosher. So this is what the Pharisees would do. They would strain out a gnat, but they would swallow a camel. So here, we can't take this money because it's the price for the bribe, but the bribe was paid by them and was probably paid out of the temple treasury in the first place. And they counselled together, and with the money they bought the potter's field for burying strangers. For this reason, the field has been called the field of blood to this day. And then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, They took 30 pieces of silver, the price for the one whose price they set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. Let's go to Acts a minute. There's a strange thing here. So if we go to the book of Acts, Peter tells what happens to Judas as well. We'll just read this before I explain it all. And it's Acts chapter 1 verse 16, or 15 in fact. At this time, Peter stood up in the midst of his brethren, gathered about him, about 120 persons, was there together, and said, Brethren, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit foretold by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became guide to those who arrested Jesus. For he was counted among us, and received his portion in the ministry. Now this man acquired a field with the price of wickedness, and falling headlong, he burst open in the midst, and all his bowels gushed out. And it became known to all who were living in Jerusalem, so that in their own language the field was called Hakamalda, that is, the field of blood. I'll probably pronounce that wrong. Now we have two different versions there. One is that Judas went out and hanged himself, and the other one is that he bought a field and fell into it, and his guts gushed out. So which one is correct? In fact, both are correct, in a way of speaking. What happened here is when Judas threw the pieces of silver into the sanctuary, he went out, he did hang himself somewhere in Jerusalem. Now that gave a problem to the authorities. If we look up Deuteronomy again, chapter 21. Deuteronomy 21, it's verse 6 to 9. And this is what to do if a body is found somewhere in a city or in the surrounding of a city. And all the elders of the city which are near to the slain man shall wash their hands over a heifer whose neck has been broken in the valley, and they shall answer and say, Our hands have not shed blood, this blood, nor did we see it. Forgive your people Israel, thou hast redeemed, O Lord, and do not place this guilt of innocent blood in the midst of thy people Israel, and the blood guiltiness shall be forgiven them. If a body was discovered, either in a city or around a city, it was counted as being guilty of the blood of that man until it had been discovered. Obviously, sometimes a body would be found and it would be nothing to do with the city. There were certain procedures they would follow. In Jerusalem in particular, now that was a problem, because the whole city would become unclean if a body was discovered in the city of someone who had died by, died by violence, or in this case by strangulation. So Judas's death made the whole city of Jerusalem unclean. Now that was a problem because it was the day of Passover, and there was a major sacrifice going to happen very soon. And so effectively, that sacrifice could not happen because Judas's body was within the city. So the rabbis had come up with a solution to this problem, because it probably had happened beforehand quite a few times. The solution was this: the body would be taken down to the lowest part of the city and thrown over the wall. This is their equivalent of brushing it under the carpet, I suppose. And the body was therefore on the outside of the city. And the city would therefore be clean. They would have the sacrifices, and then the next day someone would go and deal with the body that had been thrown over the wall. If you have a copy of the notes that I've sent you, there's a picture of Jerusalem there, and there's the gate at the very bottom is called the Dung Gate. At the time of Jeremiah, I think it was called the Potsherd Gate. Basically, it's where all the rubbish was taken out and dumped. And it's the particular reason they would put all the rubbish down there was actually back from the Old Testament times. That particular section of the valley, on the left-hand side, if you're looking at the picture, on the left-hand side you have the valley of Hinnom. On the right-hand side you have the Kidron Valley. Where they meet together was a place that in Old Testament times, one of the kings, King Manasseh I believe it was, actually used for the sacrifice of children. And so it was, in the Jewish mind, a completely contemptible place. And so that is where, in later times, they turned it into a rubbish dump. And they would that's where they would be burning the rubbish and everything else. That actually area became Gehenna, I think, which is the place of constant burning, where the worm does not die and the fire does not cease. And that's what became hell in the minds of the people. And it was at that place that the body was to be thrown over the wall. Now, also, the name the Potsherd Gate from the old days lets you know that that was also a place that belonged to a potter. And you can imagine when a potter would fire his kiln, there would be a lot of broken pots. They reckon at least 20% of pots would break in the kiln. And any archaeologist will know there's great big piles of broken pottery near an old block kiln. And you can imagine that the potter would not be happy to come out in the morning and find a dead body had been thrown over the walls and landed in his property. And I suspect this had been an ongoing argument between the potter and the religious authorities for quite some years. And so when Jesus throws the 30 pieces of silver into the temple, they see a solution to their problem. They will buy this potter's field from the potter where he dumps all his potsherds, and they will use it for burying strangers, for people who have died by violence. And it will also mean when they're thrown over, it throws onto their property, or the temple's property, not to theirs. In fact, it's not even the temple's property, it should be noticed, because they cannot take the money into the temple. But what they do instead is they buy it in Judas's name. It's Judas's money, so they buy this field for him and solve their little problem. Of course, the irony being that Judas is the first person to be thrown over the wall and to fall down into this area, which is undoubtedly where his guts burst open, or by the time that they come to clean him up, his guts would have burst open, because the heat out there would have made the body swell up very quickly. So both statements are true. Judas hung himself, but also where his body was then slung over the walls, it fell into this land. And so it became known as the field of blood to the people. Now, there's another problem actually here. If we're looking at the Matthew 27, verse 8. For this reason, the field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price for the one whose price they had set upon the sons of Israel. Bit of a difficult reading. Then let's go to the actual place where that comes from. It's actually the book of Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 11. What Matthew is actually quoting comes from Zechariah, not from Jeremiah. So chapter 11, verse 12. God has been asking the prophet to act as a shepherd, to dress up as a shepherd and to walk around in Jerusalem and to give prophecies. And now God's told him to go to the authorities and to ask for payment for his duties as a shepherd. And he's not expecting anything, but they decide to insult him. And the way they insult him is by saying, well, what your ministry is worth to us is 30 pieces of silver. I've mentioned before, 30 pieces of silver is the price of a dead slave in the Jewish law. So by giving him 30 pieces of silver, they are insulting everything he has done and everything he has said. So we read from verse 12. And I said to them, if it is good in your sight, give me my wages. But if not, never mind. So they weighed out 30 shekels of silver as my wages. And then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, that magnificent price which I was valued by them. So they took the 30 shekels of silver. So I took the 30 shekels of silver and threw them to the potter in the house of the Lord. So it seems that Matthew is misquoting there. But there's actually something more behind that. Jeremiah, who he says is quoting here, actually has a lot to say about the potters as well, in this same place where the potsherd was actually broken. So if we turn up to Jeremiah 19, and we start off with verse 1 and 2. If you know the book of Jeremiah at all, you know that he has a lot to do with potters. Thus says the Lord, go and buy a pot, earthenware vessel, potter's earthenware vessel, a jar, and take some of the elders of the people and some of the senior priests, and go to the valley of Beth Hinnom, which is by the entrance to the potsherd gate, and proclaim there the word that I shall tell you. So where Judas's body was thrown over, this potter's field is exactly the same place where Jeremiah is actually sent with this broken pot. Or this pot hasn't been broken as yet. If we go on to verse 10 of that chapter. Then you are to break the jar in the sight of these men who accompany you, and say to them, thus says the Lord, just so shall I break this people and this city, even as one breaks a potter's vessel, which cannot again be repaired. And they will be buried in Topeth, because there is no other place to bury. Topeth was the place where the children had been sacrificed by the previous king, the place that was condemned, this place that was turned into a rubbish heap. So Jeremiah was saying, I will bury bodies in this rubbish heap. But more to the point, what happens at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection, when the Romans destroy the city, there are so many bodies that they end up burying them in the rubbish heap in Topeth, in exactly the same spot, in this field of blood where Judas was thrown over. So what Matthew is actually referring to here is the prophecy that this will become a place of blood and burial, because there will be no other place. And it's prophesying the events that will happen in 40 years' time at the destruction of Jerusalem. Let's go on now in our story. Let's go back to John. Now we're going to bring the Romans into the situation. I have some sympathy for Pilate, to be honest. Oh, and in the end, he's still in the wrong, but I have sympathy for Pilate. Let's go to John 18, verse 28. And they led Jesus, therefore, from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. And they themselves did not enter the praetorium, in order that they might not defile themselves to eat the Passover. Now that section there, some people look at that and go, this all must have happened a day before the Passover, which is why they say that the Last Supper wasn't actually the Passover supper. In this particular case, the high priests had a special meal on the morning of Passover. That lamb that was brought out at dawn and tied to the temple would form a special feast for the 24 chief priests and the high priest, and only they would be allowed to partake of that particular sacrifice. So in that case, that was the Passover lamb, the official Passover lamb that was chosen by the high priest himself as the symbol of the whole thing. So in this particular case, it's probably that they are talking about. Now it's interesting, they won't even go into a Roman dwelling because it makes them unclean. So poor Pilate has to come out to them. So 29. Pilate therefore went out to them and said, what accusation do you bring against this man? Now this is very early in the morning. He's been got up early. All this lot have come rampaging down, dragging this man and throwing him into the guard. So Pilate obviously goes, okay, accusation please. And they answer and said to him, this is verse 30, if this man were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. Now that's not an accusation. That's not a crime. That is, just kill him because he's a baddie. Nothing else. Now Pilate was a particularly brutal man, but one of the things that Romans were very strong on was the justice system. There had to be an accusation, there had to be witnesses, that had to go through the procedures, and here there is no procedure. Pilate therefore said to them, "Take him yourself and judge him according to your laws." The Jews said to him, "We are not permitted to put everybody to death." Now, they had come up with some more laws. So if we go to Luke 23 again, at this point they start coming up with some accusations against Jesus. So it's Luke 23 and it's verse 1 and 2. Then the whole body of them rose up and brought him before Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Now, of those accusations, misleading the nation, well, possibly he was telling them the truth, forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Now, we already know when they tried to catch Jesus out with that basically he said, yes, you should pay to Caesar what is Caesar's. So that is a complete lie on their part. And they said that he himself is a king, is Christ, a king. You know, it says a king, not the king. Now, but at least Pilate now has something to go on, if you see what I mean. But also, let's go back to John again. Okay, I'm reading from them. From verse 29. Pilate therefore went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered and said to him, "If this man were not an evildoer, he would not have delivered him unto you." Pilate therefore said to them, "Take him away and judge him yourself according to your law." But the Jews said, "We are not permitted to put anybody to death." And the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke and signifying what kind of death he was to die. Pilate therefore entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered and said, "Are you saying this on your own initiative? Or did others tell you this of me?" Pilate answered him, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and your chief priest delivered you up to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom," he's admitting he's a king, "my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting, that I might not be delivered up to you, or up to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Pilate therefore said to him, "So you are a king?" And Jesus answered and said, "You have said correctly that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, to bear witness of the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" You can imagine the bitterness in that voice. But, having said that, he then goes out and says what is truth. And when he had said this, he went out to the Jews and said, "I find no guilt in him." So it's obvious to Pilate. In fact, somewhere else it says he knows that it's for jealousy they've handed Jesus up. It's obvious to Pilate that Jesus is innocent. But he still has a problem. They've still handed him over. But if we go to Luke 23, again, verse 4. Pilate said to the chief priests and the multitudes, "I find no guilt in this man." But they kept on insisting, saying, "He stirs up people, teaching all over Judah, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place." But when Pilate heard, he said, "Is this man a Galilean?" And when he learned this, that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was also in Jerusalem at that time. This is what we call passing the buck. He knows he's innocent, but pass him over to Herod. Herod can deal with the problem. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he wanted to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign performed by him. And he questioned him at some length, and he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. Notice the chief priests and the scribes would go into Herod's house, but they wouldn't go into Pilate's. And Herod and his soldiers after treated him with contempt and mocked him and dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day. for before that day they had been at enmity with each other. It's strange how Jesus brings enemies together against him. The reason that Pilate and Herod had been against each other is when Pilate had first taken over as procurator in Jerusalem, he had tried to put, I believe, shields with a picture of Caesar in the temple. And this was going to cause a riot. So Herod and his brothers actually wrote to the emperor saying, please stop him doing this. At which point the emperor had written back and told Pilate off. And so Pilate was very angry because they were little telltales running around telling him on him. So they hadn't got on with each other and they didn't really want to talk to each other. So that is why they were enmity. But after this point, obviously, they become friends and start talking to each other again. It's obviously to be noticed here, though, that the purple robe comes from Herod. So the king actually robed Jesus. But go to verse 13 of Luke 23. Pilate summoned the chief priests, this is when Jesus has been sent back, and the rulers and the people, and said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites the people to rebellion, and behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in the man regarding the charge which you have made against him, nor has Herod, for he sent him back, and behold, he has done nothing deserving of death by him. So both at this point, Herod and Pilate both pronounced Jesus to be innocent. Now, verse 16, I will therefore punish him and release him. That's strange, isn't it? I will punish him and release him, even though he's been found innocent. In a strange way, Pilate was actually trying to save Jesus' life at this point. What he thought is, if I rough Jesus up a bit, then they'll be satisfied and then they'll go away. And that they'll be happy with that. Let's go to John 19. And it's 1 to 12. This is Pilate trying to be nice. Then Pilate took him and scourged him. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and arrayed him in a purple robe. That's the robe that came from Herod. And they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews! And they gave him blows in the face. Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know I find no guilt in him. Jesus therefore came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. But that wasn't enough for the chief priests. When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him. And Pilate said to them, Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered and said, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself to be the Son of God. Pilate, therefore, when he heard this statement, was more afraid. Now, the reason he was more afraid of that was Caesar described himself as the Son of a God. So now this is becoming closer to a crime in Roman terms. So verse 9, And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? And Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, Do you not speak to me? Do you know that I have authority to release you? I have authority to crucify you. Jesus answered, You would have no authority over me unless it was given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me up to you has the greater sin. Pilate would have known all about authority. In his position, he was given authority by those above him. Something that's going to come into place now. He had got his authority from a friend of his called Sejanus. Sejanus was powerful in Rome, but a short time before, he was trying to organise a rebellion against the emperor. The emperor had caught on to this. Sejanus had been killed and all his followers. Pilate, sitting out on the edge of the Roman Empire, at this point had avoided it. But he knew that the emperor was trying to get rid of all those who may have been involved in this plot against him. So Pilate now knows he is in serious trouble here, which explains what happens next. Verse 12. Now, as a result of this, Pilate made every effort to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. For everybody who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." In other words, we'll just send off a letter to Caesar, and he's looking for a reason to get rid of you. When Pilate heard these words, he brought out Jesus and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, which in Hebrew is called Gabbatha. Once the judge has sat down on the judgment seat, he cannot get up again until he has pronounced either guilty or not guilty. Now this was the day of the preparation for the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." This is probably one of the saddest verses in the Bible. They therefore cried out, "Away with him! Crucify him!" And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Let's go to Samuel. 1 Samuel. It's 1 Samuel chapter 8. This is when the Samuel is getting old, and his own sons are not particularly any good to take over from him, and so the people are thinking for the future. So 1 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 5. And they said to him, that's to Samuel, the people were saying to Samuel, "Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your way. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations." And this thing was displeasing in Samuel's sight, when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regards to all of this that they say to you. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." In the Jewish perspective, the king of Israel was God himself. So when the high priest said that we have no king but Caesar, they were committing the ultimate blasphemy in order to kill Jesus. And at this stage, there's a character, obviously, I've not mentioned up to this point, Barabbas. If you know the story, Pilate, as part of his effort to get Jesus out of trouble, he has to release one prisoner at Passover to the crowds. And so he appeals to the crowds. Who do you want? Do you want this popular guy, Jesus? Or do you want this murderer, Barabbas? And obviously he expected the crowds to call out for Jesus. But at that time in the morning, probably the main crowds hadn't heard about this, and certainly the high priest would have made sure they had enough of their supporters in there, and they call out for Barabbas. At this point, Pilate turns their own laws against them. Let's go back to Matthew 27, and it's 24. Matthew 27, 24. And Pilate, when he saw that he accomplished nothing, but rather a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourself." And all the people answered and said, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then he released Barabbas to them. I think the bit where it says there, the scourging of Jesus, that had happened, as I say, that had happened before. That's not in chronological order there. The washing of the hands was actually referring back to the incident we looked up in Deuteronomy, where a body was found. The elders of the city would have to wash their hands over a sacrifice and say, "We are not guilty of this man's blood." So here's Pilate using one of their own Jewish rituals against them. said, "I am not guilty of this man's blood." And the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." That literally came true at the storming of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, when the Roman soldiers, everybody who was in the city was killed. They went systematically through and they killed man, woman and children. So basically the generation and the children, this word came true. I do not believe, though, that the blood of Jesus is being held against the Jewish people after that. Every generation has a choice to make. So in the past it used to be believed by the Catholics that the Jews were eternally cursed by this. I do not believe that. We will leave it here today. The next time we will do the crucifixion and the resurrection. I think we should have the bad news and the good news on the same day. Let us pray. Father, what injustice, what hatred, what malice that your Son took and was silent. Lord, that he did that for us. Lord, may we never forget what it cost Jesus and cost you to bring us salvation. Amen.